I used to believe silence was a form of strength, that if I held things together long enough, the cracks would stop spreading. Then, one ordinary evening, my wife crossed a line so casually, it took me a moment to realize what she'd taken from me. No shouting, no scene, just something gone that wasn't supposed to be hers. If you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, you might recognize what came next. The morning started the way most of my mornings did. I packed my son's lunch while scanning emails on my phone, tied my shoes by the door, and listened to him complain about a math quiz he hadn't studied enough for. Traffic moved slower than usual on the drive to his school, but nothing felt out of place. I dropped him off, watched him jog toward the building without looking back, then headed downtown. I arrived at the office before most people. That had become a habit over the years. Quiet hallways helped me think. I reviewed shipping reports, approved payroll, answered 2 calls from regional managers. Everything worked because I kept it working. That was my role. Founder, CEO, the man who absorbed problems before they reached anyone else. Around noon, my wife called. Her voice sounded casual, almost distracted. "I spoke to Mark this morning," she said. "About what?" "The investment account. I told him to move the funds." I paused, pen hovering above a notepad. "Which funds?" "The reserve. It made sense to consolidate. That account wasn't just family money. It was tied to the company, built for emergencies, structured carefully with my signature on every decision." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct her. I told her we'd talk later, and ended the call. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Meetings blurred together. Numbers still added up, but something felt off, like a door left unlocked. I drove home to Marietta in the early evening, rehearsing nothing in particular, just letting the road do its work. Dinner wasn't just the 3 of us. Her parents had stopped by. Plates clinked. Someone poured wine. Conversation stayed light until her mother mentioned the account again, smiling as if it were a shared accomplishment. "It's a relief knowing that's handled now," she said. "Handled how?" I asked. My wife answered before anyone else could. "I took care of it," she said. "It was overdue." No hesitation, no glance in my direction. The room stayed quiet for a beat too long. Her father nodded. My son looked down at his plate. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not sharp, not explosive, just pressure. That decision wasn't hers alone. She knew it. They all did. Still, I let the moment pass. I told myself this wasn't the place. Not in front of family. Not tonight. The conversation shifted. Dessert came out. Someone laughed too loudly at something unimportant. I finished my coffee and excused myself, saying I had an early start the next morning. Outside, the air felt heavier than it should have. I sat in my car without turning the engine on. The dashboard clock blinked. My phone stayed face down in the cup holder. I replayed the moment in my head, not with anger, but with a growing sense of disbelief. It wasn't just about money, it was about permission, about being removed from a decision that belonged to me, without discussion, without respect. For years, I had told myself that keeping the peace mattered more than asserting control, that absorbing discomfort was part of being a husband, a father, a leader, that strength meant restraint. Sitting there, hands resting on the steering wheel, that belief felt thinner than it ever had. The silence I'd relied on didn't feel noble anymore. It felt like something else, something that erased me a little more each time I chose it. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, already knowing sleep wasn't going to come easily that night, already aware that the routine I'd trusted for so long had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore, even as the road carried me forward through the dark. The next morning moved faster than it should have. Emails stacked up overnight. 2 managers waited outside my office before I even set my bag down. Nothing had changed on paper, yet the tone had shifted. People spoke carefully. Conversations stopped when I walked by, then resumed at a lower volume. No one challenged me outright. That would have been easier. During a budget review, someone referenced a decision I hadn't approved. My name appeared on the slide anyway. I corrected the number without explaining why it was wrong. A few heads nodded, a few didn't. The meeting ended on time, but the room emptied with a different kind of urgency, as if everyone had somewhere else to be. At home, the mood followed me. Her parents called with practical questions that weren't really questions, suggestions dressed as concern. My wife moved through the kitchen as if the previous night had settled something. She mentioned schedules, repairs, plans for the weekend. I answered when necessary and kept my voice even. Silence still felt like the responsible option. It just didn't feel protective anymore. By midweek, the whispers reached farther than I expected. A cousin asked if I was stepping back from the company. An uncle joked about finally taking it easy. None of it sounded malicious. That made it worse. Assumptions took root where clarity should have been. I told myself to let it pass. Time had smoothed over worse moments. Experience taught me that reacting too soon often created more damage than waiting. Still, something kept pulling at me, a steady reminder that waiting only worked when everyone respected the pause. I walked to a coffee shop near the office one afternoon, the kind of place where people stayed long enough to finish a thought. The line moved slowly. A familiar voice called my name. Marcus stood a few steps behind me. We hadn't spoken in years, not since he sold his stake and moved on. We sat near the window. He didn't ask how I was. He asked how long it had been. Since what? Since you stopped being included, he said. I didn't answer right away. He stirred his drink and watched the ice melt. I'm not taking sides, he added, just noticing patterns. That was his way, direct without theatrics. I told him about the account, the dinner, the way decisions seemed to skip past me lately. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back. You're carrying everyone else's comfort, he said, and calling it leadership. I wanted to disagree. Wanted to explain context, history, the reasons patience mattered. None of it came out. He didn't press. He just looked at me long enough for the thought to land. Silence only works, he continued, when the other side understands it's temporary. We talked about work, about our kids, about nothing important. When we stood to leave, he put a hand on my shoulder, not as reassurance, more like a marker. Back at the office, the day wrapped up without incident. Reports went out. Calls were returned. I approved a vendor contract I'd reviewed twice already. Everything stayed orderly. That order felt fragile now, like it depended on me not shifting my weight. Driving home, I noticed how often I checked my mirrors, not for traffic, but for signs I might be missing something else. At a red light, my phone buzzed with a message from a board member asking to talk later in the week. No explanation, just a time suggestion. I replied with a simple yes, and pulled forward when the light changed, hands steady on the wheel, mind already sorting through what needed attention next, even as the space around me continued on its usual rhythm. The elevator stalled on the 7th floor longer than usual. I checked my watch, then the panel. Before I could press anything, the doors opened and Ray stepped in with his cart. He'd been in that building longer than most of us upstairs. We exchanged a nod, nothing more. Halfway down, he cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, eyes on the floor numbers, "you might want to double-check who's been coming into your office after hours." I looked at him, waiting. Ray didn't smile. He didn't dramatize it either. I clean late sometimes, saw files moved, not tossed, organized different, thought you should know. That was it. No accusation, no theory, just an observation from someone with no reason to invent one. The doors opened in the garage. He rolled his cart out, leaving the words behind like a loose thread I couldn't stop pulling. The rest of the day unraveled quietly. I replayed recent weeks in my head, meetings I hadn't been invited to, summaries forwarded instead of discussions, decisions framed as updates rather than choices. None of it looked alarming on its own. Together, it felt deliberate. Doubt crept in next. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Stress did that. Leadership came with isolation. I'd told younger executives that more than once. Still, something about Ray's tone stayed with me. He hadn't tried to protect me or warn me. He'd simply passed along a fact. Back at my desk, I pulled up my sent folder, scrolled through approvals, cross-checked dates. A few emails hadn't reached me until after actions were taken. Others had been summarized instead of attached. The pattern tightened. At home, information felt filtered. Conversations shifted when I entered rooms. Plans were discussed as if they'd already been agreed upon. When I asked follow-up questions, answers came polished, rehearsed. My wife spoke with confidence, never hostility. That made it harder to push back without sounding unreasonable. I stopped asking certain questions, not out of surrender, but calculation. Instead, I listened, paid attention to timing, noted who spoke to whom and when. A legal pad stayed tucked in my briefcase, filled with shorthand reminders only I could decipher. Late one evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I opened my laptop and set up a private folder. Nothing dramatic, no hacking, just copies. Email chains saved, calendar invites archived, files downloaded the way anyone with access could do. I told myself it was temporary, just insurance. At the office, I adjusted my schedule, skipped one standing meeting, declined another with a vague conflict. The space that created let me see what filled the gap. Decisions moved forward without pause. That answered more than any confrontation would have. A board member called that Friday, asked if everything was all right. The question hovered, carefully worded. "I'm fine," I said. "Good," he replied, "just checking." We talked numbers, projections, safe ground. When the call ended, the absence of specifics said more than concern ever could. The sense of order I'd relied on didn't collapse all at once. It thinned. Threads loosened. Trust didn't shatter. It shifted out of alignment until nothing sat where it used to. That realization didn't bring panic. It brought focus. I reduced contact with two people I'd once looped into everything. Not cutting them off, just narrowing the flow. I asked my assistant to route certain requests through me again. Framed it as efficiency. No one argued. One afternoon, while reviewing a contract, I noticed my signature line missing from the final page. Someone else's name sat there instead. The document had already been sent. I closed the file and leaned back, letting the chair creak. For years, I'd believed structure protected everyone involved. Systems, roles, clear chains of responsibility. Now I could see how easily those same systems bent when one person stopped paying attention. I gathered my things at the end of the day, nodded to Ray on the way out, and drove home without turning on the radio, thoughts lining up one after another, already sorting what needed to be watched next as the week ahead waited. The conference room filled up slower than usual. A few seats stayed empty. Others were taken by people who rarely attended these meetings. That caught my attention before anything else did. Laptops opened. Notebooks stayed closed. The agenda appeared on the screen, already finalized. My wife sat 2 chairs down from me, posture relaxed, fingers resting on a folder I hadn't seen before. When the meeting started, she didn't wait for me to speak first. She never used to do that. "Before we move on," she said, "there's an update on asset management we need to address." The word "need" landed carefully. No urgency, no apology. She stood, connected her tablet, and walked through a restructured allocation plan. Numbers shifted, authority lines adjusted. A new oversight committee appeared on the slide. My name listed as advisory. Not approving, not final. Advisory. I followed every change without interrupting. Questions came from around the table. She answered them smoothly, referencing discussions I hadn't been part of. A few people glanced my way, searching for a reaction. None came. When the vote was called, hands went up. Not all of them. Enough. The decision passed. The meeting moved on to logistics, timelines, risk mitigation. I contributed where facts mattered, corrected a projection, clarified a contract term, kept my voice level. The room adjusted to the new balance quickly. People always do. Afterward, conversations clustered near the door. I gathered my notes at a measured pace. A director I'd worked with for years gave a brief nod, then turned back to someone else. Another offered a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. Back in my office, I closed the door and reviewed the implications line by line. Signing authority reduced, access rerouted, communication filtered through 2 additional layers. Nothing illegal, nothing loud, just effective. An assistant knocked and handed me a revised approval workflow. My name appeared less often than it used to. She hesitated before speaking. "Let me know if you want me to flag anything," she said. I thanked her and sent her on her way. Calls followed. One from a regional lead asking for clarification. Another from a partner confirming who should sign off moving forward. Each time, I provided the updated answer without commentary. Let the structure speak for itself. At lunch, I sat alone. Food cooled untouched while I mapped consequences in my head. Influence depended on access. Access depended on perception. Perception shifted fastest when no one challenged it. By mid-afternoon, the effects reached beyond the office. A banker I'd worked with for a decade asked to loop my wife into future correspondence. A consultant forwarded a question to her first, copying me after. I didn't object, not yet. At home that evening, she mentioned the meeting as if it were routine. "It went well," she said. "I saw," I replied. Dinner continued. Our son talked about school. Plates were cleared. She asked if I wanted to review something later. I told her I had emails to catch up on. In my study, I opened documents I'd saved weeks earlier, compared them to the new framework. Differences stood out now, sharper than before. This wasn't improvisation. It was preparation. I sent a short message to Marcus. "Do you have time this week?" The reply came back quickly. "Tomorrow morning." I closed the laptop and sat there longer than necessary, listening to the house settle into its usual rhythm. The routine still worked. That was the problem. One decision had shifted leverage in a way that couldn't be undone by patience alone. The room that once responded to my presence had already recalibrated. Waiting would only confirm the new arrangement. I stood, turned off the light, and headed upstairs, mentally listing what could still be moved, what needed protection, and which parts of the system I had allowed to run without supervision for far too long as the day finally let go. Chapter 5. The Choice I Couldn't Avoid. The message arrived just after midnight. No name, no greeting. A link and a short line. "You should see this before it disappears." I didn't open it right away. Let the phone rest on the table while I poured a glass of water. When I finally tapped the screen, documents loaded one by one. Account transfers, email threads, meeting notes stamped with dates that lined up too well with what I'd been excluded from. Nothing dramatic on its own. Together, they formed a timeline I hadn't been allowed to see. Memories followed without warning. Dinners where my opinion landed last. Family gatherings where jokes cut a little too close, then passed off as harmless. Moments I'd brushed aside because pushing back felt petty. Looking at those files, the pattern sharpened. Respect hadn't eroded overnight. It had been chipped away, quietly, with my consent. Sleep didn't come. By morning, the house stirred as usual. Breakfast routines continued. My wife moved through the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, voice lowered when she noticed me. A conversation ended abruptly. She smiled and asked if I wanted coffee. I declined and left early. The law office sat a few blocks from where Marcus and I used to meet clients years ago. He greeted me without ceremony, set 2 cups on the table, and waited. I laid the documents out in order. He scanned them slowly, asked a few precise questions, then leaned back. "You're not crazy," he said. I didn't think I was. Good. Because this isn't emotional. It's structural. He didn't talk about revenge, didn't suggest confrontation. He pointed out obligations, exposure, the difference between authority and access, explained how easily one could be removed from decision-making without breaking a single rule. Your leverage, he added, comes from clarity, not noise. We discussed options that stayed within the lines, filings, safeguards, timelines. None of it offered satisfaction. It offered stability. That mattered more. By the time I left, the choice had narrowed. Not between fighting and letting go, between reclaiming control or watching it dissolve completely. The shift became obvious by the end of the week. A rumor surfaced that I was preparing to step back. Another suggested internal disagreements had weakened leadership. No one asked me directly. Messages stopped coming to my inbox. Invitations arrived late, if at all. At home, the distance grew sharper. My wife spent more time on calls, less time explaining anything. When I mentioned a board conversation, she brushed it off. "They're just trying to keep things calm," she said. Calm for whom wasn't discussed. My phone buzzed constantly with half questions from people testing where I stood. I answered selectively, gave nothing away, let assumptions hang. The quiet that once protected others now served me. One afternoon, a familiar reporter's name popped up on my screen. I didn't respond. An hour later, a colleague forwarded an article draft asking for comment. It painted a picture of transition, framed as progress. My name appeared in past tense more than present. I closed the document and forwarded it to Marcus. "They're moving faster," I wrote. His reply came back measured. "Then so do we." That evening, I sat in my study with the door closed, pulled up the private folder again, added the new materials, labeled everything carefully. The process felt methodical, almost calming. Each step replaced uncertainty with sequence. From downstairs, I heard laughter. A familiar rhythm carried on without me. For a moment, I considered walking down, asking for explanations, forcing a conversation that might change the tone. The thought passed. Instead, I drafted a short email to my assistant, adjusting access parameters, citing efficiency. Another to a compliance officer, requesting a routine review. Nothing aggressive, just precise. When I shut the laptop, the clock read later than I'd expected. Tomorrow's schedule waited on the desk, already altered in small ways. I slid the papers into my bag, turned off the light, and stepped back into the hallway, mind focused on what needed handling next as the house settled into sleep. Mornings took on a different shape. Instead of heading straight to the office, I drove to Buckhead before traffic thickened. The law firm sat where routines mattered more than appearances. I signed in, waited, and reviewed notes while the city moved on without me. Marcus joined with a thin folder and a pen. No greetings beyond a nod. We worked through accounts first, not the obvious ones, the quiet transfers, the adjustments that looked like housekeeping. Each line told a story when placed next to the right date. "This wasn't rushed," he said at one point. "No," I replied. "It was paced." That distinction mattered. Impulse left traces, planning left structures. We mapped both. He flagged exposures I hadn't considered. I pointed out operational gaps only someone inside would know. By the end, the folder carried weight. Back at my desk later that day, spreadsheets replaced conversations. Numbers didn't care about tone. They balanced or they didn't. I cross-checked figures against archived reports. Small discrepancies surfaced. Not theft, redirection. Authority exercised just far enough from my reach to avoid friction. Lunch came and went without notice. A cup of coffee cooled beside the keyboard. Messages arrived asking for approvals I no longer controlled. I forwarded them on, copying myself, tracking responses without comment. Emotions settled into the background, not numbness, focus. Decisions stopped carrying personal charge. Each step answered a question instead of creating one. That steadiness surprised me. For years, restraint had drained me. Now, it sharpened things. At home, I stayed present without engaging, helped with homework, listened to weekend plans. My wife spoke often, filling space, steering conversations toward logistics. I responded briefly, not dismissive, just precise. Late one night, a notification flashed across my screen. An unfamiliar login attempt, location masked, timing odd. I reset credentials and logged the event. Another message followed an hour later. No sender listed. Careful. Nothing else. I saved it and powered the phone down. The silence afterward felt deliberate. Whoever sent it wanted acknowledgement. I refused to provide one. The next few days brought more signs. A file accessed twice without reason. A calendar entry altered, then restored. Questions from people who hadn't asked them before. None of it confirmed intent. Together, it suggested watchfulness. I adjusted accordingly, shifted where information lived, changed who received what and when. Not dramatic, just enough to narrow the field. If someone reacted, I'd know where to look. Marcus called midweek. "They're probing," he said. I figured. Good. Stay consistent. Consistency became the rule. Same arrival time, same responses, same tone. I let routines mask preparation. In meetings, I contributed facts and withheld opinions. Let others fill the gaps. Patterns emerged quickly when space allowed it. One afternoon, my assistant mentioned a request routed around me. "I thought you should know," she said. I thanked her and asked her to continue as instructed. Her shoulders eased. People noticed when pressure lifted. At night, I reviewed notes alone, not obsessively, methodically. Each piece slotted into place. The situation no longer felt chaotic. It felt contained, even if the container was under strain. Another message arrived near dawn. This one tried a different approach. Friendly, vague, asking if everything was okay. I read it once and deleted it without replying. By Friday, the sense of being watched sharpened. Not fear, awareness. Like hearing footsteps match your pace without seeing who followed. I adjusted my route home, stopped at the grocery store, picked up items we needed, paid in cash. In the driveway, the house stood quiet. Inside, familiar sounds drifted from upstairs. Life carried on in parallel, close enough to touch, distant enough to feel separate. I set my bag down, checked the time, and opened the folder one more time before dinner, scanning entries I knew by heart now, making a small note in the margin as the next step clarified itself. Pressure stopped arriving in waves and started settling in layers. Home, work, reputation, each pressed down without announcing itself. Mornings felt shorter, nights stretched longer. Conversations carried an edge, even when they stayed polite. At breakfast, my son asked why his school form needed a different signature this time. The question landed harder than it should have. "It's just a form," I said. "You always sign those," he replied. I told him it didn't matter, and watched him accept that answer the way kids do, trusting first, understanding later. The thought followed me out the door and stayed close all day. A legal notice waited in my inbox by noon. Routine language, formal tone. It referenced a restructuring vote I hadn't participated in. My role shifted again, this time in writing. Authority narrowed to a technical title with no teeth behind it. I forwarded the notice to Marcus without comment. Calls came next. A journalist left a voicemail asking for clarification on internal leadership changes. A longtime partner emailed to confirm who should be included moving forward. The pattern no longer hid itself. The narrative had moved ahead without me. At home that evening, the house felt occupied but divided. My wife spoke with confidence, sharing updates as if they were weather reports. "The board agreed it was best," she said. "Best for who?" "For stability." Stability had become her word for decisions that excluded me. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice. The conversation ended the way many did lately, unfinished but closed. Later that night, Marcus called. "They're accelerating," he said. "I see it. There's a filing scheduled for Friday. If it goes through as written, you're effectively sidelined." I thanked him and hung up. Sat there longer than necessary, hands resting on the table, thoughts moving slower than usual. Panic never arrived, neither did anger. What came instead felt heavier. The next blow landed 2 days later in a room I helped build. A special meeting, called with short notice. I arrived on time and found my seat reassigned. The agenda skipped over operational updates I normally handled. When my wife spoke, the room followed her lead without hesitation. She proposed an interim executive structure. Temporary, she said. Protective. My name appeared under consultative support. I scanned the faces around the table. Some avoided my eyes. Others looked relieved. The vote passed quickly. No debate, no pause. That was the moment something gave way. Not loudly, not visibly. Just enough to change how everything felt. Silence stopped feeling like strategy. It felt like consent. After the meeting, no one lingered. People packed up and moved on. I stayed behind, gathering papers I hadn't needed to bring. The room emptied around me. Outside, messages stacked up. Condolences disguised as concern. Offers to talk later. No one asked what I wanted. Driving home, the thought I'd avoided finally surfaced. If this continued, custody would become leverage. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because instability made everything negotiable. The idea of losing daily access to my son tightened something in my chest I hadn't known was still loose. At a red light, my phone buzzed again. A text from my wife. "We should discuss next steps." I didn't reply. The house greeted me with familiar sounds. Dinner dishes clinked. The television murmured from another room. Life carried on as if the ground hadn't shifted beneath it. In my study, I closed the door and pulled out the folder I'd been building, piece by piece. Reviewed what I had. Reviewed what I lacked. The margin between them had narrowed. Marcus's words from weeks earlier returned, uninvited. Silence only works when the other side understands it's temporary. I sat there, weighing what staying quiet would cost versus what speaking up would trigger, aware that doing nothing had already set its own consequences in motion, as the evening moved forward without waiting for my decision. The call came from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "You don't know me," the voice said, "but I worked with the firm that handled your secondary accounts." No introduction followed, just a pause, like the person on the other end was measuring how much to say. We agreed to meet later that day in a place neither of us frequented. He arrived early, sat with his back to the wall, and kept his coat on. No small talk. A folder slid across the table. "These weren't supposed to leave the office," he said, but they didn't feel right. Inside were transaction records tied to shell entities I'd never approved. Clean paperwork, proper formatting, the kind of work that passed audits because it followed rules written for trust. Dates lined up with the gaps I'd been tracking. Names surfaced I'd seen only once, then dismissed. I thanked him without asking why he'd come forward. Motives complicate facts. He stood, nodded once, and walked out without waiting for questions. Back in my car, I didn't open the folder again. Drove instead. Let the traffic carry the moment until it settled into something usable. Hope tried to push its way in. I kept it out. Too early for that. Marcus cleared his afternoon when I called. We spread everything out on the table, old and new, and started aligning timelines. The picture sharpened. Authority hadn't been taken from me in a single move. It had been siphoned, rerouted through proxies, justified as efficiency. "This is your leverage," he said, tapping one page. "It's not dramatic," I replied. "It doesn't need to be." Back home, life continued on schedule. My wife moved through the house with the same ease she'd adopted weeks ago. Confidence remained intact. She spoke about upcoming meetings, framed decisions as settled matters. When I asked a neutral question, she answered without hesitation, then changed the subject. Denial looked comfortable on her. That was the mistake. I spent the evening cross-referencing the new material with what I'd already logged. One discrepancy led to another. Each connection reduced the story she'd been telling to a series of omissions. Emotion hadn't driven any of it. Planning had. The advantage she held wasn't persuasion. It was momentum. Once that slowed, everything else came into view. A message arrived near midnight. This one tried warmth. "Let's not drag this out." No threat, no apology, just impatience. I archived it and returned to my notes. The next day brought another public appearance. She spoke at a luncheon, projecting calm leadership. An article followed within hours, quoting unnamed sources praising decisive action. I read it once and closed the page. Truth doesn't compete with narratives. It waits. Marcus advised patience, not the kind that absorbs damage, but the kind that positions pieces where they'll matter most. Filings prepared quietly, notifications scheduled, lines drawn without announcement. At dinner, my son talked about a project he'd been assigned, needed help organizing sources. I listened, offered a suggestion, watched him jot it down. The simplicity of that exchange grounded me more than any document had. Later, while the house settled, I reviewed everything one last time. The missing piece fit cleanly, no force required, just alignment. What I'd mistaken for her strength was really dependence on concealment. Once facts stood on their own, reactions became irrelevant. I closed the folder and slid it back into my bag. Tomorrow held a meeting she believed would finalize things. I set my alarm, laid out what I'd need, and turned off the light, letting the quiet stretch forward, already aware that the balance had shifted, even if no one else had known. The room wasn't large. It didn't need to be. A long table, neutral walls, a clock that worked too well. Everyone arrived on time, which told me how much weight the meeting carried. My wife took a seat across from me, papers arranged neatly, expression controlled. She looked prepared. So did I. The attorney on her side opened first, outlining a version of events that framed efficiency as necessity. Decisions had been made, authority reassigned, risks mitigated. The language sounded clean, familiar. It had been used on me before. When it was my turn, I didn't counter with emotion. I placed the folder on the table and slid it forward, page by page, letting the sequence speak. Dates, transfers, communications routed through intermediaries, approvals logged without disclosure, no commentary, just order. Questions followed, not from her, from the people tasked with accountability. Clarifications requested, cross-references checked. Each answer tightened the frame. She leaned in at one point, voice steady. "That interpretation ignores context," she said. I met her eyes without responding. Context had been her shield. Facts didn't need one. The discussion moved to compliance, to fiduciary duty, to the difference between delegated authority and concealed control. Someone asked why I hadn't been informed sooner. I explained the filtration, the summaries, the rerouted access, not as complaint, as explanation. A pause settled over the table while documents changed hands. The clock ticked. No one filled the silence. She tried again, this time shifting tone. "We were under pressure," she said. "I did what I thought was necessary." The phrase landed without effect. Necessity doesn't erase process. Pressure doesn't excuse concealment. The room understood that. I felt the old urge rise then, the habit of stepping in, smoothing edges, carrying discomfort so others didn't have to. It surfaced and passed. This wasn't that moment. The final question came from someone I'd worked with for years. "Were you aware of these actions at the time they occurred?" I answered honestly. No. That was enough. The conclusion didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with notes taken, actions outlined, follow-up scheduled, interim measures enacted, oversight restored where it belonged. Not to me personally, to structure. When the meeting adjourned, chairs moved back quietly. People gathered their things. No one congratulated me. No one apologized either. That was fine. She stood across from me, expression tight now, control slipping just enough to show strain. "This didn't have to happen this way," she said. I nodded once, not in agreement, not in defiance, just acknowledgement. Outside, the hallway felt longer than before. I walked it alone, steps unhurried. Messages waited on my phone. I didn't check them yet. The drive home took the usual amount of time. Traffic flowed. Radios played. Nothing marked the shift that had just taken place. At a stoplight, I rested my hands on the wheel and breathed out slowly, not from relief, but release. At the house, lights were on. Dinner smells lingered. My son's backpack leaned against the wall where he'd dropped it. I set my bag down and washed my hands, letting the water run a second longer than necessary. Upstairs, voices carried from another room. Life hadn't paused for the meeting, and it wouldn't adjust overnight. That was fine too. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my phone, scrolling through updates I'd missed, already sorting what required response and what could wait. Aware that the balance had changed not because I demanded it, but because I'd finally allowed the truth to stand where it belonged. Peterwork has a way of arriving after decisions are made. Notices followed the meeting in a steady sequence, each one precise, unemotional. Roles adjusted, access defined, timelines established. Nothing felt rushed, and nothing felt kind. That was the point. At home, the distance turned practical. Conversations narrowed to logistics, schedules, school pickups, medical forms. No attempts at repair came from either side. The house still functioned, just without the illusion that it held us together. I met with my attorney again, this time to discuss separation terms. No raised voices, no bargaining over dignity. The documents reflected what had already shifted. Control returned where it belonged. Boundaries drawn without explanation. "You're allowed to stop carrying everyone," Marcus said as we wrapped up. I didn't answer him, not because I disagreed, but because the habit he named had been with me too long to dismiss with words. It showed up everywhere. In meetings where I softened outcomes, in family moments where I absorbed disrespect to keep things calm, in the belief that endurance equaled love. The consequences for her moved forward on their own timeline. Reviews, audits, formal inquiries. Not dramatic, not public in the way movies imagine, but visible enough to change how people spoke to her. Invitations slowed, influence thinned, structures corrected themselves. I didn't watch closely. Knowing it was happening was enough. One evening, she asked if we should talk. "About what?" I said. She paused, searching for something familiar to hold on to. I waited. Nothing came that hadn't already been said in other ways. "We'll coordinate through counsel," I added, and went back to what I was doing. Mornings grew quieter. I took my son to school more often, helped him organize his backpack, reviewed assignments, listened to stories that had nothing to do with adults. The simplicity steadied me. At work, the environment recalibrated. Meetings resumed their old shape, though not their old assumptions. People checked in again, not to appease, but to align. I responded as needed, left earlier when possible. The company no longer required my constant presence to justify my position. One afternoon, I packed a box from my office. Not everything, just what belonged to me. Photos, a notebook, a pen I'd used for years. The assistant offered to help. I declined and carried it myself. The drive home took me past the route I'd avoided for weeks. Traffic flowed. The city kept its pace. Nothing signaled closure. At the house, I placed the box by the door and changed into clothes meant for movement, not meetings. A duffel waited upstairs, already half full. Laundry folded, documents stacked neatly. I added a few items and zipped it shut. Downstairs, dinner simmered. Plates set out of habit. I served myself and sat at the table. The chair across from me stayed empty. The quiet felt earned. Later, I stepped outside to take a call. A colleague confirmed the final adjustments had been implemented. No congratulations, just confirmation. Understood, I said, and ended it. Inside, I washed my plate and set it in the rack. Checked my phone once more. No messages required response tonight. Upstairs, my son knocked on the door as I folded the last shirt. "You leaving tomorrow?" he asked. "Early," I said. He nodded, satisfied with the answer. That was enough for now. When the house settled, I carried the duffel downstairs and set it beside the box. Turned off the lights one by one. Paused at the doorway longer than necessary. Not to reflect, just to register the stillness. Outside, the car unlocked with a familiar sound. I placed the bags in the trunk, closed it gently, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine started without hesitation. I checked the mirrors, adjusted the seat, and pulled away from the curb as the street opened ahead, already focused on the road without needing to look back.